of the IB network, and those of you who are from other types of schools as well. I am Susan Zeiger, as Anne-Marie mentioned, and here we are for visual. Anne-Marie and I are both historians, social studies specialists, and program directors at Primary Source. And for those of you who are not as familiar with our organization, I know a number of you are old Primary Source hands from the names that I recognize, but for those of you who are new to our organization, I'll just quickly say that we are an education nonprofit based here in the Boston area, and we are a resource center and professional development center for K-12 educators. Our purpose is to support educators who want to teach their students about the whole globe, global studies and global history and cultures, and we prepare teachers to prepare their students to do that through offering graduate courses, workshops, online courses, study tours for about 2,500 educators each year. They then in turn prepare their students to take part in and collaborate with peers around the world. And we have resources of all kinds as well on our website and in our library. So we are so glad that you've joined us on a Saturday for this professional learning experience, and we're hoping that we'll learn from you and from one another as well through discussion, questions, and comments a little bit later on in the session. Here's the session agenda for today, so you'll know what we're doing together and where we're heading. So we'll start first with a discussion of primary sources and inquiry in the social studies, some introductory and important concepts to get us all on the same page and to review what some of the important ideas that have been coming out through the National Council of Social Studies and other places about this important topic. So what is the marriage between primary sources and inquiry learning all about, and how does that apply in global education? Then we'll talk through inquiry learning based on global primary sources by doing two examples for you. Running through, we'll actually look at the materials together and have you try some of them out. One is an Ancient China for elementary unit or activity, and the other involves contemporary South Korea for secondary students, but both have application and adjustment for other grade levels. Then we'll take a pause for questions and discussion, and we'll end the session by sharing some resources that we think are very good places to find material for teaching global primary sources, teaching with global primary sources for your students. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Anne-Marie, who is going to get us started with our first topic. She's going to tell us about primary sources and inquiry-based learning. Anne-Marie?
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Susan, and welcome to everyone. As Susan just introduced me, I'm Anne-Marie Gleeson, and I'm excited that you're all joining us today. We thought we would focus today's session on global primary sources around how they might be used in the inquiry process. There's been a lot of recent work about inquiry, particularly in social studies, and we thought it was a really good fit. And no matter what subjects you teach, actually, if you want to start jotting down in the chat box what subjects you teach and grades, that would be great. But no matter what the topic or the grade, inquiry is central to learning, and we'll just do it in its simplest form in the sense of thinking about inquiry involving posing a question, gathering sources, and analyzing evidence to answer the question in a systematic way. So the type of question that guides learning in an inquiry process, it really should be open-ended, engaging, and significant. I like to think of the questions as essential questions to kind of stress the importance of engaging with compelling and significant themes or topics. Oftentimes in inquiry, obviously the questions that could be generated by you as the teacher or as a focused guided inquiry, or having students craft their own inquiry questions and generating them themselves. So thinking about inquiry helps students develop the disciplinary metacognitive skills, so kind of the processes that professionals in the discipline might employ in their work. As I mentioned, in terms of some of the new work that's coming out, the recent National Council for the Social Studies new C3 framework, our College Career and Civic Life framework for social studies education, sets inquiry at the core of all social studies learning. And we work a lot with social studies, but we do other topics as well. So we might frame things today around social studies, but I just want to be clear that this process and this type of work can be done in any topic. But if you're not familiar with this document from NCSS, you'll want to take a look at the document. It's a free PDF download. The URL is on the screen at socialstudies.org. You can just Google C3 Framework. And you can read a little bit more in depth about the rationale for building social studies around inquiry. But it seemed like a really good fit for us to talk about and to help think about how we can get students to think about social scientists who use inquiry all the time, and how students can replicate, to an extent, the same type of processes while constructing their own knowledge. So today, we'll think about, with inquiry, you can have any one large kind of main essential question, but then think about some smaller supporting questions as well that might help us answer the larger question. So I'll give an example here. So for example, if we were studying world regions, we might ask an essential question around the impact of geography on the development of a region. So that's our big question in the center. Then we might have students think about the smaller supporting questions focusing around discrete topics, such as transportation, infrastructure, economic development, and how all of those factors are related to geography. So using that, taken as a whole, that these smaller questions can help us answer the larger question. And so the session today is on primary sources. So where do they fit within the inquiry process? Inquiry and primary sources, they're a very natural and important pairing. We need the evidence to answer our questions and answer our inquiry questions. So primary sources, they provide the raw data for that. Gathering primary source materials related to the topic of inquiry and then evaluating those sources, they provide the evidence needed to support claims and answer inquiry questions. So this is the type of work that historians and social scientists do in their study of historical and contemporary issues and events. So that's what we want our students to start to think about. And this really sets the core of what research is. So we wanted to focus a little bit around how might you use global primary sources to help your students answer important inquiry questions. And what does this look like across the grade levels? Because I see here, and I didn't follow as quickly, but I see a couple first grade teachers, 7th grade, 4th grade. We're running the gamut here. Librarian for upper school, 9-12, 7th grade, elementary. So what does this look across grade levels? In the inquiry process, it really is the same across all grade levels, but the questions and approaches and sources, they definitely will vary. Younger students might examine the impact of geography by exploring the physical features in one or more regions. They might look at images. So I've got an image up here, an image of a river and a mountain. This is in Peru, actually, as their primary source evidence to answer a question. And then as you go up through the grade levels, older students might study the relationship by exploring the historical development of particular regions. Text-based sources such as this is an 1855 map of Peru. They could use the map alongside of this photo of a national park in Peru to construct a claim about the relationship between geography and societal development over time. So the underlying idea here is that students will pose a question and draw upon primary source materials to gather the appropriate evidence to answer their questions. And so we wanted to give you a few examples on what this might look like and how you might do this with your students. So I'm going to turn it over to Susan to start our first example.
Very good. Thank you, Anne-Marie. So I'm going to begin with modeling. The model I'm going to share comes from a unit on ancient China. And following on Anne-Marie's point about the importance of questions and beginning with good questions, we want to start our inquiry with an important, open-ended, challenging set of questions to answer. So as this is a unit for middle elementary students, hypothetically, we're going to ask the question, what can we know about the lives and beliefs of people in ancient China? And for supporting questions, we have two here. So what are some of the teachings and beliefs of the philosopher and teacher Confucius? and that's a question that places us at a particular time with a particular thinker to give it more specificity, the essential question. And then the second one, what can we learn about ancient Chinese beliefs and values from an object found by archaeologists? And that question directs us to the kind of primary sources that students will be examining in our inquiry. So with that, let me share with you an object. And initially for this activity, I'm giving you zero contextual information. This is just one way to launch a primary source inquiry. I wanted to stress that, and there are many different approaches to do that. But today, for this activity, we're going to start without any preparation at all. And let me give you a minute first to look at this very intriguing object yourself and think about it for a moment. Now, I'm sure that someone out there knows exactly what this is. You may perhaps have taught about or with such an object, and if you can just hang on to that thought for a moment, we'll give you a couple of moments. We'll give you an opportunity to share that shortly. But when we have an object like this, we want to give students some ways to vocalize what they see and describe it. And here's a very simple protocol that gives some students sentence stems for examining an object. I'm sure many of you are familiar with or perhaps have even used this approach. It's from the Harvard Graduate School of Education Visible Thinking Project. And I really like it, although it's very simple. It does really the important things that you need students to do as they're working with a visual source or an object. So I see is directing students to make observation. I think is asking them to draw inferences from the observations that they've made. And the question about wonder, I wonder, is about posing questions and formulating questions. So it's useful for that reason, and let's think for a moment about how we could apply it to the object that we have at hand here. And you should feel free, if you like, to put some of your own I think, I wonder observations into the chat box if you'd enjoy doing that at this time. I've made up some typical kinds of comments here, then a conversation that you might have with students about this object. So when we've taught about it, students might say, I see an object that looks solid, sturdy, a little shiny, I notice, with some intricate detail and decoration. Maybe if they're very observant, they'll notice down at the bottom, you can't quite see it so well in this particular view, but it looks like there's the face of a dragon down in the bottom portion of this object. So I think, based on those observations, that this is made of metal because it's smooth, it's slightly shiny. It looks the way that metal looks when it gets old. And I wonder, most of all, what this is, what it was used for. And that last question is a great one. It's not so obvious, first of all. You could guess many different things. Perhaps it's something you put on your head, although it looks too heavy for that. Maybe it's a container that we're looking at upside down, or there are many different answers that you could give to that question. But the question about function is a fantastic one. It opens us up to all sorts of further and related questions, which could be scaled up or down depending on the age and sophistication of the learner. So why was it made? Who made it? How is it made? Why do we still have it? What do the designs or decorations have to do with the function, and so forth? But here's the main point. It's the questions that are going to propel the inquiry forward and the answers that students find through further information and research. And if they're authentic questions, that is, they're questions that students are genuinely curious about, then we have the basis for engaged learning in social studies, which is what we're hoping for. So now, how about getting some of our questions answered? So here we want to add some additional information. And I'm going to do that for you here by providing this photo. I hope you can see that well enough to discern a little bit about what's going on there. And hopefully what you can see is that we have here people playing objects like the ones we had in the mystery object that we looked at a moment ago. And so, in fact, these are ancient Chinese bronze bells. And I'm curious to know how many of you knew that already. So if you want to use your hand raise feature over on the toolbar right underneath where it says participants, you can tell me if you knew that this was a bronze bell from ancient China that we were looking at. Okay, we've got a couple of people there who knew that as well. That's great. These are magnificent ancient objects there, and it's crucial to know that our original object, although it was alone in the British Museum and probably taken away from a whole set, it was originally cast as a very large set of bells. It could be 60 or 70 of the bells of many different sizes, and they were played by being struck with a long wooden paddle, and you can see the musicians there hitting the bells and playing them. You can still hear sets of these bells more than 2,000 years old that are played on important occasions in museum performances, and also you may recall that for the Beijing Olympics, a modern Chinese composer was asked to compose a piece that was performed on a set of bells that were several millennia old. So that's very exciting to hear. And I put at the bottom of the slide here a link that you could listen to and view a performance on a set of ancient bells. That's really fun to hear. It's a beautiful, eerie, resonant sound to listen to. So the photo that we looked at is just, in fact, the tip of the iceberg about what we know about this object. And I want to share with you now the exhibit page from the British Museum that will tell you much, much more about the particular bell that we were looking at. This page points us to a fantastic resource that I would love you all to know about, and I'm interested to know if anyone knows this site or has used it. Again, you can raise your hand or type that into the chat box if you are familiar with this BBC British Museum collaboration. It's a real favorite of mine. They created a website a couple of years ago called The History of the World in 100 Objects. And it became a wildly popular BBC radio series in Britain. There's also a fabulous website that goes along with the set and includes great zoomable views with rotation and labeling for the objects. There's the radio spot. You can hear the audio for these wonderful little radio documentaries, one for each of the 100 objects. There's photographs that extend the learning outward. There's a beautiful interpretive essay by a British Museum curator. There are maps, there's lesson plans. It's heaven for social studies teachers. Really interesting, and they're from all over the world from diverse periods of time. So it's a fun site to check out. But based on this site and some other accessible research, there's so much more to know about the Chinese bronze bell that we're looking at today than we possibly have time to talk about. Let me just offer 3 quick insights for you to get a flavor of this. So first thing that I can tell you is that our bell, this bell, was cast in the age of Confucius between 400 and 500 BCE. And that's interesting because Confucius and his proteges wrote quite extensively about music, and music likely that was performed on musical instruments like this one. And he and his followers wrote about the ability of music to add balance and order to society, very important Confucian notions of a harmonious society, and they felt that this music could help to promote that. Bells were also, we know, used for ceremonial and spiritual purposes as well as for enjoyment and entertainment. It was thought that the sound was a way to connect the realm of the living with the realm of the ancestors. And we know that from burial sites where there were full instrument rooms buried with a lord or other elite figure, and also from the intricate inscriptions and characters that appear inside this bell and in others, reflecting on their purpose. And finally, such bells reflect the incredible advanced achievement of China during the Bronze Age. It took another 1,000 years before Europeans were able to figure out how to cast bells of this size and musical tonality. So that was that reflects something about what was going on in China in this time period. So I'll stop there with the historical details, but there's one, here's one of the key takeaways from this model example that I wanted to share with you, and it has to do with primary source selection. Most of the time, it's really helpful and important to choose sources that we know something about, that we know quite a bit about, in fact, and that have excellent supporting materials, meaning that historians, archivists, and researchers have worked on and given us contextual information about those sources. That way, students can probe further and get many of their questions answered. Which is not to say that we can't acknowledge the limits of our knowledge in history. That's certainly part of disciplinary learning in history and social studies too, and sometimes developing well-founded theories and guesses, as you've done with your students, is part of historical inquiry. So I'm not saying that that's not a legitimate and important part of learning how to be a historian, but the point is that when we pull the random historical image off the internet that comes with little information, which we all do sometimes, it isn't the best way, basis for an activity like this one, where you want to be reasonably well informed about a primary source and its context if you're using it for a deeper student inquiry. So that was one important point that I hoped to share with you. And then finally, let's round this out by revisiting our inquiry questions. So having taken a quick tour through or done a quick primary source inquiry based on the object that we started with, did this allow us to find some answers to the questions that we posed in the beginning? And I think that they did. So what can we learn about Chinese beliefs from this object? We've learned that people in ancient China, perhaps we've learned that they valued music, that they honored ancestors, believed in that the connection between the living and the dead could be maintained, and music could be important in that process. And regarding Confucius, we learned that he valued harmony and order, and he believed that music promoted those important values. So that rounds out my example, and now I'm going to pass it on to Anne-Marie for an inquiry activity for secondary students. Hey, Anne-Marie?
All right, thank you, Susan. There seems to be something going on behind me right now, so if the audio is a little poor, please write it down in the chat room, and I'll see what I can do. But I think we're good. So on the second example, we wanted to look at, well, first I'll just say that the second example could be scaffolded up or down, so for either middle or high school students. We designed it thinking about grades 7 through 12, and again, different pieces of it. And in this particular activity, we wanted to explore the impact of the division of North and South Korea on South Korea's rapid industrialization during the past 30 years and recent, well, relatively recent labor unrest, and utilize quantitative and qualitative sources. So the focus of this activity is around using primary source evidence to support an inquiry claim. So here we're really going to focus on the evidence piece here and what you might take out of that, particularly with a focus on integrating qualitative and quantitative sources, although most of the examples I'm showing today will be the quantitative piece. But how can we get students to look at multiple different forms of primary source materials to support their inquiry process? So our essential question, the big question here, I think, would be around how did South Korea's economy develop following the division of the Korean Peninsula? And then with smaller core questions to support that larger inquiry focus, what factors contributed to South Korea's rapid industrialization, and what ways did South Korea's rapid industrialization affect the lives of Korean workers? So that's what we'll get at through these sources. So the sources that we focused on in this particular activity were related, again, with the multi-format. So we want students to look at charts, students to read a photo, and also answer a question. So how might they answer their inquiry questions here? And in this particular case, there were aspects of teacher-generated questions with the main kind of how did the division impact South Korea's economy. But there was also room for students to generate their own questions based on the primary source materials. So I'll ask you if you come up with any questions that you might have for future study as you look at some of these sources with me. That would be great, because we can think about how a teacher-generated question leads to future student-generated questions as they start to investigate the primary sources and the materials. So in this particular case, we created questions asking students to think about facts from the economy, from data and photos, which we'll look at in a moment, inferences about what was happening, and then questions that they might have based on the resources that they looked at. So similar to what Susan talked about, we could start an inquiry just around asking what you think this particular image is about. So if anyone has any thoughts in the chat box, what you think this image might be about. We're talking about South Korea and labor. Give you a moment to take a stab at it. But also, in the interest of time, I'll give you a little bit of context here. Okay, I see that Eileen mentioned that it was a strike, which is indeed the case. It was a 2011 labor strike, and this is an image out. And Carol would like to see the URL about a strike at an auto parts plant, which is definitely the case. So what we're going to do here is, in this case, the police were subduing the strikers, as Judy just pointed out, who were protesting in front of the factory and were refusing to go to work at that point. So I would start with asking students just as a really open inquiry question about what they thought this photo was about. There's a second photo if I wanted to pair it, if I thought that they needed a little bit more context, or we've actually looked at both photos together. And then, let's see here. So then I wanted to bring up this graph. So here is the pairing of visual image with the photo to now we have some hard data. And this particular graph we created, but it was collected from the OECD stats, and this happens to be July 2011. And we created the graph through the NCES Kids Zone Create a Graph function, and if you're not aware of that program, you can just Google NCES Kids Zone, and they've got great graphing materials that work really well for, I'd say, late elementary, middle school students, and high school students as well. But so take a look at this graph of the GDP of South Korea between 1970 and 2010. What can you, if we have some time to add a couple comments, what do you take away from this graph? What is it saying about South Korea? So we've got, again, the GDP from 1970 to 2010, marked in US dollars over time. So one of the things that students are automatically able to pick up from this graph as we kind of examine what the different axes are, is that GDP grows dramatically between 1980 and 2010. So we start off with that image with the strikes, and we're seeing here a massive increase in GDP over a 20-year span, 30-year span actually. And so we wanted to delve a little bit deeper into that. So the next graph and chart that we wanted to use here, now we're trying to connect the two a little bit. So this is a graph of the hours worked, average hours worked per country in 1 year. This happens to be 2008, and this again the data came from the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, so OECD. And you'll see in the very center of this graph, and I don't know if you can see my pointer here, so I think you can. I just put a star button there. The OECD total for countries, the total average is about 1,764 hours worked. But then you'll see up top here in the very last bar, looking at Korea, and in this case it is South Korea as the distinction here. And one of the things that students automatically notice right away again is the distinction, or just in terms of how many more hours that workers in South Korea worked then as compared to the rest of the country, or the rest of the world, sorry. And we might even point out for relative comparison the number of hours worked in the United States and in other nations. And then again, going back to that median for the world average. So now it's kind of putting all of that information together. And here was just one more graph or chart that we wanted students to look at and think about. Something to note is that if you look at the average annual hours in 2006 compared from 1980, that even though South Korea was so high in 2008, they actually had almost a 20% decrease in the amount of hours here. So we're just kind of putting all of this information together. So we have all of our different, I guess I'll go back to the slide for a moment. We have all of these different pieces of data and thinking about, well, what kinds of claims can we make? So what might these charts and graphs suggest about labor or South Korea's economic development? If you wanted to take a stab in the chat box, what are some things that students might make claims about based on the data that we just saw here? So we've got the number of hours that workers worked. Going backwards here, we've got the mass increase in GDP for South Korea. And then we've got this photograph of the 2011 strike. So what are all these pieces? What kinds of claims can we make? So we're using this data to answer our inquiry question here. As you're thinking about what some of those claims we might be able to make, I'll also add, I hope I'm not giving anybody whiplash here with the slides. We also added a Korean newspaper article where we had students then look at the text about the strike and about the economy and to add to that. But I see here Susan has added to one of our claims about how productivity takes toll on the workers. So certainly that was part of the reasoning behind and some of what happened with the strike in 2011 of workers really protesting against the long hours and the amount of work. So those are some things that claims that students were able to take away from this material. And with the text, when we had the news article, they were able to really break down the text and think about text-dependent questions to compare with the graphs. And I think Sandy's here, but we're assuming we know the reason for the strike, and that's certainly true. So that's why we then had the newspaper article so that students could learn a little bit more. So it's filling in more of that context and creating new questions. So especially if you just started with the charts and the images, we didn't have all of the information. So there were student-generated inquiry questions where they then could look through newspaper articles and a few other articles that we provided, and thinking about how this might inform their understandings of what was happening and what other information did we still need, what was missing. And we brought that around with the assessment, so thinking about how could you build onto this research for the inquiry process. So we had students think about an activity creating a character profile where they had to do more research about the strikes or about workers in general, reflecting on evidence and thinking about their inferences. Other extension possibility activities would be combining it with literature, thinking about the differences between North Korea and South Korea. I'm sure you're very familiar with this North Korea at night image in terms of there's no electricity, no light shining from the night, so what's the difference between the North Korean and South Korean economy. So getting back to our broader inquiry question, our essential question initially. So that was just one way that we thought about using data and integrating quantitative and qualitative sources, primary sources, to help the inquiry process. So So after that example, we wanted to open it up. I'm going to actually open it back up to Susan to think about what questions and comments you might have.
Thanks, Henry. Yeah, we would love to take a pause here and give you a moment to start to put some questions together. We'd love to hear your comments as well, if there's anything here that's resonated for you. We've already seen some interesting and great suggestions or thoughts in the chat box about that. But go ahead and raise your hand if you'd like to use your microphone and speak and share a thought with us, or pose a question for either of us. We would love to hear your thoughts about that. We're interested in knowing what sort of global primary sources you use with students. Have you had a successful experience with using primary sources and doing inquiry with primary sources as you've been teaching about diverse areas of the world with your students in the many different age levels and grade levels that this group is working on? So let's give you a moment here, and again, raise your hand if you'd like us to call on you to ask a question, or feel free to type them into the box. I know it takes a moment to put things into the box. We also are going to go on to resources, and if you need a little more time to formulate your questions, you can do that, and we can go ahead and look at some resources first. So let's just take a moment and see if anyone's got anything to share at this point. Okay. Okay, good. Well, let me give you a little more time then to think about what you'd like to ask, if anything. Maybe you're getting what you need just from the listening to, and that's fine as well. And while we're doing that, I think I will just go ahead and share some of the resources that we wanted to point out to you. So we wanted to offer you some of our favorite sites and best suggestions for where to go when you want to do this kind of in-depth teaching with diverse global primary sources with your students. And we should acknowledge that it's a lot harder to find primary sources for teaching about global regions outside of the English-speaking world, and even outside of the United States. There are globs and globs of great primary source websites, starting with the National Archives and Library of Congress. Primary source sets, there's an abundance of material for doing U.S. history and U.S. topics, but it's much harder when you're talking about and trying to teach about a global world. There are translation issues, there's context is difficult for teachers to understand sometimes, that we don't get the references in popular culture resources, and things need to be explained to us, and we're crossing cultural boundaries. So there's lots and lots of reasons why it's harder to do that. There isn't the same infrastructure of translated sources and so forth. So it is challenging. But we will, but nonetheless, there are some great places to go, and we wanted to share a few of those with you. So let me start first by pointing you to the site where our own two examples came from. So the URL you'll get at the end, you'll be able to access the PowerPoint, and all of these references are in there, and URLs are in there. So don't worry, you'll be able to go back and find things that interest you. So Anne-Marie and I both took our examples from a resource called Primary Source World. Primary Source World is a collection of activity clusters created by a primary source with the support of classroom teachers and scholars in the field. And here you can see the topics in our collection, or some of them. They roll down off the page there, but we have about 12 different topics, cluster topics, with another on Ottoman history very soon to launch. So you can see that some of the themes that we have for these primary source clusters include daily life in Japan, and that one is specifically for elementary students. We have Latin America and the Cold War. We have a cluster on modern Afghanistan. Native Americans, interaction at the time of settlement, and women in China is another topic. We also have one you can't see off the bottom of the page on women in the Middle East, voices of women in the Middle East. So for each of these topical themes, we have 3 activities, and each of those activities is built around a different, really intriguing kind of primary source. I think going back to the bronze bell activity that I shared, that comes from a cluster on teaching ancient Chinese arts for elementary students. And we also in that cluster have an activity based on a hand scroll, a beautiful hand scroll painting and legend that goes along with it, and another on dragons and the decorative arts and some decorative arts items. And likewise in Anne-Marie's cluster, I think she told you about, right, so she did South Korea, and there's the labor strike photo. For understanding North Korea, there's a graph of food shortages, very disturbing, an important one. And then there's a popular song that has a very political point to it about reunification. So that's primary source world, and I think hopefully you'll get a chance to explore those and see some of the formats that we've used to work with primary sources and inquiry with students. They're all the materials that you need for those activities are included for free in the website. Let's see, Anne-Marie has some questions come in at this point that would be good to, or comments that are good to share.
I think, so Carol had a question about, are students able to access the primary source resources, or is there a student portal for information? And at this point, there's no particular, there's no boundary from students not being able to access this portal. So they can use all of the information and materials that are up. What we do, the way that we do organize everything though is that we think about teachers as the primary audience. So some of it is set up so that there are lesson plans on the primary source world, for example, but there's no reason that students can't use the resources.
Great. Thank you for that. Good question. So let me share another resource that is one that we really like very much too, another favorite go-to site for us for global sources, and that's the World Digital Library. The World Digital Library, here's the homepage, is a United Nations
Susan, I'm just going to jump in for a second.
Sure. Sure.
I'm just going to say that I am typing the URLs in the chat box, and I actually just realized I spelled World Digital Library wrong. So if you are looking for the URLs to these sites, you can get them in the chat box.
Oh, great. Thank you, Emery. That's great. And if you want to open, yes, we're just looking at screenshots now, but if you want to open them up, they're much more fun. All the sites we're sharing are very interactive and a lot of fun to work with. So do feel free to do that. As in talking over that. So this is a project of the United Nations, UNESCO, and the lead institution is our own Library of Congress in the U.S. But it's important to know that it's a cooperative venture of libraries and national museums all around the world. And each country chooses what it will contribute to this remarkable digitized collection. So I like the fact that it's not just a U.S. perspective on what's valuable in other countries' cultural patrimony, but the countries themselves are defining what the set looks like and what to contribute. And the home page for this site is a nice world map, colorful and usable. So you can go to the part of the world that you're interested in and quickly click on it and find the items that are linked. So Latin America and the Caribbean, for example, you open that up, what you see is this page that shows that has thumbnails and shows the 353 different resources that sources that have been selected by museums and state governments and libraries throughout Latin America. And you can see some of the diversity of the types of sources there as well. So there are artwork, there are atlases, there are explorer accounts, legend books, all sorts of maps, and they're generally not just a single image like a painting, but the whole book. So all the illustrated plates might appear in just one of those sources. There's some really remarkable material there. They're very high resolution images with great zoom tools. So if you choose one of the books an illustrated book to work with, for example, students can go right into the image and look at details and zoom in on them and can point things out. You could do a very nice teaching lesson. They're very teachable in that way. The context information is also, for all of the materials, is multilingual. So it's offered, and you can select the language that you want to receive the material in or read the material in. So that's a nice thing for world language teachers and library folks. You can do a lesson in Spanish about ancient Chinese art, reading the interpretive material in that target language, or you can translate between two different languages. There are some audio files of mini lectures by curators. It's a really lovely site in many ways, and there's a lot of remarkable material there to work with. So that's the World Digital Library. And also, I wanted to point out that another great kind of source for students to learn about the world is online newspapers. There are global newspapers. There are some great newspaper sites that you can use, and this is a good one to know about, Online Newspaper Directory. This has regional newspapers accessible by region, with thousands of newspapers for each country and region. So you can get instantly to the home pages of newspapers all over the world, and you can do all kinds of lessons. A teacher we work with did a lesson on how the Arab Spring events were reported in countries throughout the world. So she was able to take a particular day in Taksim Square when there were some very momentous events going on and look at 3 different Egyptian newspapers covering the event, newspapers from Saudi Arabia, Israel, European countries, and a variety of U.S. newspapers, all by working with materials on this site. So that made it really great. A lesson on multiple perspectives about current events, and it's exciting to look at that material in that way. The Common Core, of course, Common Core, it's an approach that's very much aligned with Common Core as well. So that's newspapers, and then the last, or 2 more quick sites to share. So I'm going to skip to this one. Yes, maps. Historical maps is another source of material for studying world regions, and there are some really great map collections of historical and contemporary maps. The University of Texas has one of the most famous, and perhaps you've used the Pere Castaneda website for digitized maps. It's a marvelous collection. I really love Old Maps Online. I know Anne-Marie does too. It's one of those sites you have to put aside 2 hours, because as soon as you go onto it, you're a history nerd, you're not going to be able to get off of it again. But here's Old Maps Online. And Old Maps Online accesses map collections from throughout the world. So it's sort of like a master collection of maps from many places, but it's very fun to work with, because what happens is you type in to the search box the place that you want to look at, and then you get in the center a modern map of that region. There's a box that you can work with, and you can troll around and put your box down in a particular area that you want to focus on, make it bigger and smaller. In this case, I typed in Istanbul, and what you're seeing down the side of the page here is a long list that you can scroll through of historical maps that cover this exact region. And as you move your box, this is actually changing, and the site within the historical map is changing too. So then you could go over here and you could select this 1909 map of Constantinople, click on it, and you get in this box here exactly the same area that you started with, but from this historical map in 1909. It's so fabulous, really, really interesting and engaging for students to work with. And then you can see how the same area was drawn and described in an 18th century map and a 19th century map from different countries and so forth. So that's a really great place to go for historical maps. And we are running short on time, so let me just tell you one last site to know about, which is, I'm going to go back to this, which is the Internet Archive. The Internet Archive is a nonprofit digital library that seeks to offer free universal access to digital content. It's trying to be the Library of Congress to the Internet, to the world, even more than the Library of Congress, I guess. And it is archiving all digital information. So video, you can see here on this homepage here, video, live music, audio, podcasts, text, and web pages. So there are 397 billion web pages that have been preserved in this Internet Archive, and it's really worth exploring. It's a place that you can go when you're trying to find video of all kinds, audio podcasts of all kinds too. So that's one to watch. It's a growing project, and so far it's something that teachers are just beginning to take advantage of. I think it's going to need a lot of work to create lesson plans using material from this site, but it holds great promise for learning about the world. So that is a selection of resources we want to recommend. And let me go back now and see if there are any other questions that anyone would like to pose, and anything.
Susan, I've been answering some of the questions as they've been coming up through the chat box. So, I think at this point most of them have been covered. But certainly, if there is someone who wants to ask another question, that would be great. But I do know that we're running out of time. But
yeah, that's great. Thank you, Emery. Yes. Oh, you're so fast. That's great. Good. Okay. That's great. All right, thank you. I'm catching up there. So at this point, probably then we'll go on to let you know how you can stay in touch with Primary Source and some of the things that we have, some of the opportunities that we have coming up. We would love to be in touch with you to follow up in any ways that we can, to share resources, or we have a full-time librarian on our staff who is happy to field questions, research and reference questions. Her specialty is exactly our specialty, K-12, global learning, and her link is on, a link to email her is on our library homepage on our website. We have just posted our Summer Institute registration site for next summer. We have both face-to-face and a big collection of online courses for the summer, so check those out if you're interested in doing some professional development with us. We have, for example, an 8-week course, The Enduring Legacy of Ancient China. We have 4-week courses on Africans in the Age of Atlantic Slavery, a new course on the Understanding the Islamic World Through the Arts, and Essential Topics for Global Understanding is our core course for global learning in the classroom, K through 12. So we would love to see you in our courses in the future. And
Susan, can I interrupt for a second?
Sure.
So we've had a couple of questions about the PowerPoint to today's session. So first of all, a link to a recording of this session will be mailed to you, emailed to you after this session. I actually don't know if it's another 24 hours or within the next day or so. You'll get a link to the recording of this. Maybe because it's the weekend, maybe not even until early next week, but you will. And if you need if that's not enough for you and you actually need a hard copy of our PowerPoint presentation, you can connect with us. I'll put my email in the chat, and we can actually send you a hard copy of the actual PowerPoint file. But you should have enough through this recording. You can go through the screens. But again, I'll put my email in the chat box right now. But you will get an email with a link to the recording of this session.
Terrific. Thanks, Emery. That's great. So with that, I think we'll wish you a great weekend. We hope that this information was helpful to you. It's been great. Thanks for sharing what you had to say and some of the experiences and questions that you had with us in the chat box, and for your involvement in the session, and have fun working with your students and using great global primary sources for inquiry. Thanks, everybody. Take good care.
And I wanted to add the same thing, so just to thank everyone for joining us and to enjoy the rest of the day. And like I said, please contact us at primarysource.org. You can email me at Annmarie, so it's ANNMARIE, at primarysource.org, and we'll make sure you get access to all the resources that you're looking for.
Bye-bye.
Great. And at this point, we'll end the session. So thank you again for joining us.